Sign in. Huh. Okay, cool. So today we're going to be thinking some more about the vertebrates, and we're going to be picking up with amniotes. Right. So when we were looking at our earliest tetrapods, right, we were looking at basically fish that started developing limbs and crawling out of the oceans and rivers. Now, during those earliest phases, they likely would have been returning to the water periodically, returning to the water to breed. They would have been comfortable in both land and water, so we would classify them as amphibious, right? So they have two environments that they're in, both land and water. Okay. So the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, is actually very easy in biology. Definitely the egg, right? And that's going to be what's separating out our amniotes. We're going to have a new kind of egg as we have a transition to. So what we're looking at here is basically what a fish egg or an amphibian egg looks like. So you can see you have like this outer kind of jelly layer. If you've ever looked at like tadpole eggs, right, like frog eggs in a pool of water, or fish eggs or something, like you've seen that jelly layer, right? So they're really wet and they need to stay wet. Actually, my mom told me a very weird story about something she did on a dog walk a little while ago, like last year. She walks in the forest with my dog that she's taking care of for like an hour a day. And it got really hot and dry, right? So the frog puddle started shrinking and shrinking until it was just like a little bit left, just like teeming with the eggs. So my mother starts like scooping with her hands, like moving these gross wet frog eggs into like a larger puddle. I think they started eating each other, but she's very attached to these frogs now. So her babies.
Oh my God.
Anyway, but she had to do that because, well, she didn't have to, but the frogs would have died because amphibian eggs just like can't really work in a dry environment. So this whole jelly capsule dries out. This is where the oxygen and carbon dioxide are doing gas exchange, dissolving through that jelly capsule into the growing little embryo. As it gets too dry, you're done. So as we're moving forward in time through the Carboniferous into the Permian, and then as we continue into the Mesozoic, our tetrapods are going to be expanding into drier and drier places. So the water is getting really scarce as we're fully moving to land. So if you wanted to modify this egg, what would you do to it? Exactly, right? So when we move into our amniotes, we got a new egg. So here we see the split that we're going to be looking at. So we've got our tetrapods. They separated out from our fishes. Closest ancestors are those lobe fin fishes. So technically our modern amphibians count as loose amphibians. So our ancient amphibians would have looked a lot weirder than, just a little frog out there, but they got descendants. We're going to be moving into the amniotes, which include us, the mammals, as well as birds and crocodiles and lizards and dinosaurs and lots of stuff that we're going to be thinking about as we move forward. Okay. So we're developing a new egg form in order to adapt to those dry conditions. And yeah, we're basically putting a shell on it, right? Just like you put a seed coating on the seed around that plant embryo to help it not desiccate. We take that amphibian egg and put an extra layer on top. We can protect ourselves from desiccation a bit. So the thing is, we do still have to make it semi-permeable because we do still need gas exchange to happen across that egg layer. So here in this diagram of an amniotic egg, if you've ever seen like, I didn't say this because I'm not sure I poked one, but has anybody like poked like a snake egg or something? They're kind of leathery, right? Yeah. So they don't need to be super hard like a chicken egg, but we need something slightly breathable so that we can have that gas diffusion, that oxygen and carbon dioxide moving across without getting water loss. Right. So we got this leathery shell. And actually amniotes have kind of like 4 additional layers inside that egg. So we also adapt and have more kind of inner membrane. I mean, you don't need to focus on each of those, but they're kind of cool. So like one problem you have to deal with if you're now stuck inside your egg, right? You got your own little pond in here. If you're also pooping in your pond, right? So to deal with all the like nitrogen and stuff, right? All those waste products, we have one of those membranes, this structure called the allantois. I guess I would say that because it looks vaguely French. But anyway, so that is where we have kind of those waste products moving into. So we have a separate sac, the amnion, protecting that embryo. Then we got a little like package for its waste. We've got a yolk sac feeding it. You can see that we have some blood vessels in here kind of moving in gas as well. And then we got the mammals. We're going to have actual, like eggs and embryos developing inside the body itself as we move forward. So we're going to see more changes to reproduction as we move forward in time. This amniotic egg is only really possible with internal fertilization because this outer layer, this leathery shell, is built by the parent, right? Like, so, has anybody ever had a pet bird that laid an egg? Okay. Another sad story, right? I had a friend whose pet bird tried to lay an egg, but the egg got stuck inside because it was too big. This is not great. But the point of that being, right, like when a chicken lays an egg, it comes out with that shell, right? So the embryo already has to be inside it, which means fertilization has to happen internally because it's not going to be able to have fertilization happen across that protective coating, right? So that leathery shell or that eggshell, right? There'd be no way to get like a sperm in there and then create an embryo while still having a barrier against the environment. Okay, so we need internal fertilization for the site as well. So this is happening sometime in the Carboniferous. We're going to see these amniotes as we move into the Permian, which will be the end of our Paleozoic. The other thing that we see happening kind of around this time is some of our tetrapods are developing scales. So if you look at the skin of a vertebrate, there are roughly 2 types of layers that you see. So your very basic kind of plan is that there's like a living inner layer of the epidermis of the skin. So that's the stratum germinativum. That is the first time I've ever said that word out loud. But we got a living inner layer, and then you have a dead layer out on top. So the stratum corneum is the dead outer layer. And then in amphibians, like things like frogs, right? They're all wet. They have mucus glands, and they're actually like breathing through their skin. So they have a thin epidermis and really not much else in their stratum corneum. We're going to see that when we form scales, we permeate that layer with keratin, so like this hard protein. But amphibians need a thin skin because they're actually moving carbon dioxide and oxygen through that skin layer. But since we're starting to see our environment dry out, as we go through the end of the Carboniferous, we're going to see that these rainforesty swamps are going to become really patchy and surrounded with almost desert conditions. Our tetrapods, they want to survive, don't want to be stuck in those little islands of water. They're going to need a way to not dry out as they cross these drier regions. So as we move into the reptiles, which are what we're going to see taking over kind of first, we're going to see that outer layer, that stratum corneum, filling in with keratin, just the protein kind of forming scales. They have several more layers forming as well. If you look at the scales of a reptile, right, we start to see these kind of like foldings early in their reptile history. And then you can see those kind of folding layers getting more and more complicated as we move forward. So this is doing a kind of similar thing to forming that outer layer around the egg. It's helping us deal with drying. Okay. All right. So back to our amniotes, of which the lizards and the reptiles are going to be one. So amniotes have eggs, right? They have this new kind of egg that's protected by this outer layer. But the way we actually tell them apart within that group has to do with their skulls, which is why I brought some skulls. So our main groups of amniotes are actually distinguished based on how many openings, so like how many holes they have behind their eye. So the orbit is your eye. So we can see that on each of these pictures here. Right? And this region behind is called the temporal region. So this is like your temples, right? It's behind the eye. Right? And our amniotes have temporal fenestrae. Fenestrae comes from the word for window. I mainly remember because my 9th grade history teacher talked about the defenestration of Prague by picking up a kid and pretending to throw him out the window. Where I learned that word. So you can learn it now if you didn't learn it in such a dramatic way in the past. Temporal fenestrae are these windows behind the eye. Right? And in our different groups of amniotes, we see different numbers of them. So in our diapsids, di means 2, we're going to see 2 of those temporal openings behind our orbit. And in the synapsids, we're going to see just 1. So you can see 1 hole behind the orbit here in the synapsid, which are the group that are eventually going to lead us to mammals. In the earliest amniotes, the anapsid, we didn't actually see any of these temporal fenestrae at all. We just had kind of 1 hole for the orbit. Okay. So let's go around the room and find some skeletons and try and sort these out. So we can look at them. We got here. Let's make a pile for diapsids and a pile for synapsids. Kind of wander around. Yeah, diapsids too. It depends on what's behind the orbit. One and 2, or yeah, I think that's 1. Yeah, this one. Oh, and that's going to be the lower spot. And that one, the reason we're having trouble, that is an. Oh. Mm-hmm. So I can go like maybe with that fish. So it's got the orbit and then 1. Oh, okay. Okay, then it will be synapse. Yeah. That one's a deer.
I think you're the only one.
Mhm.
One side of it.
What you got there?
Oh,
No, I'm not like it, huh?
pretty cool. What else?
Yeah. I'm suddenly realizing I don't know what a moose skull looks like. This isn't. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
This is a turtle.
We didn't have two, why do we only have one?
So we do have modifications afterwards, yeah, so turtles are kind of confusing.
Well, it's
It
fun.
would be like kind of one.
Yeah, I was thinking about that one first, and I was like, it's gonna look confusing.
I think 1, 2 is what we're gonna say, but yeah, it's kind of regressed to that analysis. So looks more like those early aliens.
Okay. This is considered diet.
It goes within our diapses when we do our bylaws.
So awesome.
Mainly, we're just practicing looking right now, so getting confusing ones is not the worst.
Us
That's what we're
humans
looking at.
are lucky.
Yeah. In grad school, that was part of our oral exam, to make sure that we could get our PhD, was our professor would just hand us a bone and say, what is this from? Yeah, and he was our mammals professor, so he also liked to trick people by handing them a mosasaur bone, so like an extinct like, reptile, because you think that he was handing you some kind of mammal. I was like, no, it's like some weird sea snake.
Sugarform plate, yeah, and that's the galley.
The one.
Triangular.
Yeah, yeah. It would be like under. Yeah, so this is the side of the soul.
What about? So we can go into the back.
Yeah, the back is just kind of like a home for the dog.
Okay.
Mhm.
And over there.
I think you gotta.
Yeah, I think it is.
For me, through my,
Oh, wait, this one is the dialogue?
Oh, these are over there.
Yeah, this is-
This is stuff.
this is one.
I woke up and rolled
I
out of
wanted
bed.
to do overnight oats and then you didn't like.
All right, we can circle back. So as we like talk about other groups moving into the future, like a lot of how fossils get named and identified is when they find a skull and those skulls look different. So this is one of the like really basic things that they can start to look for, and we're going to see a lot of changes to jaws, feeding morphology, and skull shape as we move through our other groups. Cool. So our earliest animals are going to look something like small lizards, basically. So you can see that kind of lizard-ish body position, right? So this is our earliest known reptile. So this is in the Carboniferous, Hylonomus. So here you can see that it's an anapsid because it just has that one hole for the orbit. Yep. And you can see in the drawings, the holes are a little clearer than on an actual skull, right? Nicely shaded for us. So just the one orbit, anapsid. Then we start to see more small lizardy kind of creatures arising. So the reptiles do really well kind of first. So reptiles go in our diapsid group. So we're going to start to see things like our Petrolacosaurus. So here we can see this diapsid. So like a lizard, so might be forming scales here. We can see those two openings behind the eye, diapsid. And then we can see the synapsids down here. Even though our mammals are really going to be our remaining group of synapsids in the modern day, our earliest synapsids in this time period still mainly kind of look like lizards. So here we can see just that one opening behind the orbit enclosed in bone. So as the Carboniferous end, the rainforests start to decline, those temperatures drop, the environment's getting patchy, and the amniotes are really able to kind of take over because of their adaptations for living in dry conditions. In the rainforest swamp, the amphibians were fine because they had lots of waterways to put their eggs in, but as they try to move to dry environments, that's not really working for them. When we think about those holes, those openings behind the orbit, there are a bunch of different kind of hypotheses about why we see them and what they're for. So this is a sort of summary in picture form about what those hypotheses are. And you can see that some of them are kind of like recent. So we got a 2019 paper on here. That's the most recent one. I'll sit on here. Maybe the 2015 here. All right, so this is something people still kind of talk about, but the most common explanations for why we start to see these kind of openings in the skull behind the orbit usually have to do with this muscle distribution example, and also a little bit with this weight distribution idea. So if you think about as you're moving out of the water onto land, one thing you have to do, right, is you're going to start to have to like look around in different directions than you did underwater, right? Underwater, you're kind of pointing downwards. You can move your body to look side to side, but in order to reposition your head, your neck, and look at things in front of you, look for predators, you need different adaptations once you're on land. So as you're doing that, if you have a single whole skull, it's pretty heavy, right? Like it's made of a bunch of bone. So if you want to literally hold a neck up, you really need to kind of reduce the weight of that head. Otherwise, you're going to have a really, really beefy neck. So it gives you some more flexibility, some more like speed as you turn your head if you make it lighter. And a way to make it lighter is to reduce the bone. You put holes, there's less bone. And then also, when we look at what is actually in these holes in modern day organisms, right? Takes us a human here. We've got lots of human skulls in this building. So what we see these days running through these holes are things like musculature and especially like jaw musculature. So we think that having these holes in the skull allows you to kind of rearrange the muscles, make them longer, give them more room for attachments, so that this muscle distribution might also have played a big role in why we start to see these temporal fenestrae. So our earliest tetrapods would have been down here, some kind of amphibian, at least in terms of like our description for their habitat, amphibian, so two kind of habitats. Then we have our early amniotes with their eggs splitting out into diapsids and synapsids are what we still mostly see today. Anapsids are extinct and no modern descendants, even though the turtles kind of look like they've almost kind of reverted to that kind of form. So here we see that split happening here in the Carboniferous, and in the Permian, we can see that split is maintained. And then moving forward through our next couple eras, we can see that we have dominance of different groups in different time periods. So as we move into the Mesozoic and we talk a bunch about dinosaurs, we're going to be thinking a bunch about those diapsids and their diversification. So we can see in the modern day, we don't have all that many diapsids left. We've got some of the reptiles, we've got some birds, squamates, but our synapses really start to take over more in the modern day when we say mammals. At least we kind of focus on them more. Right. So just so that we have the word on the slides, right, at the end of the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, so the CRC, it is an event that you can put on a timeline. So that's the formal name for this. So at this point, we have more extinctions. We talked about the dying off at the end of the Devonian last time. We're going to have another dying off at the end of the Carboniferous, although this one doesn't make it to the level of one of our major extinctions, but we're shrinking to little islands of trees surrounded by dry habitat. So instead of being composed of like those giant like mosses, those lycopods, at this point, the plant life is changing too. So first we see just some tree ferns surviving, and then we start to see seed ferns and early conifers taking over in those drier environments. And after this collapse of the rainforest, initially we see a dying off, but then we start to see a diversification into more species. Right? So this is kind of analogous to what happened with like Darwin's finches, right? When we were talking about adaptive radiation and also allopatric speciation, right? Like scattered fragmented habitat means you now have isolated groups, and each isolated group might do a slightly different thing, right? So they accumulate different mutations, adapt in kind of different ways to the environment around them. So this patchy environment is part of what leads to the speciation events that we see afterwards. So we're going to finish up the Paleozoic with the Permian. Okay. So talked about our Cambrian explosion. We talked about the Ordovician, Silurian, and Devonian. We talked about what's going on with the fish. We talked about the movement to land, both in terms of plant life and in terms of our animals. Talked about how those Carboniferous forests that are developing, a major reason we have all these oil deposits in the modern day, because as they were falling into the water and dying, they didn't really yet have things that could decompose them all that efficiently. Now in the Permian, we've got these tetrapods, these amniotes kind of diversifying, and we're going to see a huge extinction event separating the end of the Permian and the end of the Paleozoic from the Triassic, which is going to be our first part of our next era. So as we go into the Permian, this is where we finally see the continent Pangaea. So prior to this, we've been looking at like Gondwana kind of in our southern hemisphere, and then this Panthelastic Ocean taking up basically most of the globe, with Laurasia acting kind of like the islands and then colliding together, sort of near the equator. Once we're in the Permian, all of our continents have kind of connected together. So we can see that Gondwana and Laurasia have come together into one landmass. And these colors, I think, represent like, let's say climatic data, right? So basically what I'm saying is yellow is going to be like drier kind of deserty regions here, and greener is more like wetter environments. So when we are looking at Pangaea, we're going to see big sections of desert on this mega continent here. And we can see that it's going to have a real range of climates. So it's going all the way from the South Pole, crossing the equator, going up to the north. And it has a lot of inland area now. We're not talking about just like little islands in a sea. We've got coastline, and then we've got major distances into the center of this continent. So our kind of makeup of environments is shifting in the Permian. So it's in this kind of environment that we're seeing those early amniotes diversifying, majorly into the synapses and the diapsids. The anapsids go extinct. So we see these different types of skulls. Okay. And we're going to focus in a little more on those early synapses because eventually we're going to be talking about us and lots of mammals. But these early synapses do look really different. They look kind of lizardy, but they've got some key traits that we really only see in modern day mammals. So one is that we just have that singular lateral temporal opening, so that single temporal fenestra, right? So you can see this example of Dimetrodon is one of these early synapses, right? And if you looked at this and you did not pay attention to these little skull holes, right? I would have said this was a dinosaur, right? So got this weird fin thing on the back. Head looks massive. It's kind of low to the ground, right? But this is actually an early form of the lineage leading us to mammal in the modern day. The Metrodon, the helicosaurs were another group of synapsids in the Permian. So you can see them up here, right? Also looking real weird, right? But distinguished by that single opening behind the orbit. So we know that they're part of this group. They're carnivores in the Permian. And as we're looking at this group, so we have the pelycosaurs, we have that Dimetrodon, we're going to see them speciating and giving rise to some more different groups. So as we're going towards the end of the Permian and then into the beginning of the Triassic, we're going to see this group called the Tharapsid. And within it, we're going to see a smaller group called the Cynodonts. Okay. So the Cynodonts actually have pretty much all the characteristics of mammals from a skeletal perspective. So our Cynodonts look real weird, right? So here we see some Tharapsids, but we have that single opening behind the orbit, that single temporal fenestra. Their skulls are starting to like bulge at the back of the head. So if you compare anything over there to like the stock skull, right? Flat and kind of nothing at the back, versus you can see a rounding at the back there of our mammal skulls over there. So this can have to do partially with the way that they hold their necks and hold their heads. So when we say that they're walking in an upright manner, we don't mean on two legs like us. We mean changing that kind of like flat crocodile, kind of like lizard slave limb posture and starting to put the limbs like kind of underneath. Okay, so underneath and starting to like kind of raise the head. Okay. We also see a differentiation of the teeth. If you look at kind of looking at teeth on the reptile, right? We look at kind of like simple pointy teeth. Same thing if we look at things like sharks, but when we start to look at mammals, we're going to have different tooth types. We've got like incisors, canines, molars, all sorts of different types of teeth and kind of more specialized teeth. So we start to see some of that differentiation of the teeth as we go into the Cynodonts as well. Okay, so they wouldn't have looked like anything familiar, but they start to have these characteristics that are really typical of our mammalian groups in the modern day. So the Tharapsids are a group of synapsids, and they would include all of the modern day mammals as well as their ancestors. So if we were thinking about our crown group, we go all the way back to our last common ancestors when we're describing the Tharapsids. So this shell-looking creature here, this is an anapsid, so this is not an example of one of the groups we're talking about. We're putting it on there so that we can see our Cynodonts and some of our early synapsids kind of like predating upon and eating this extinct anapsid creature. Cynodonts, fun fact, means dog teeth. Okay, so we can see this kind of saber tooth almost early Cynodont acting as a carnivore on this early anapsid. We also had some herbivorous versions, so we have some dicynodonts over here. And we're looking at a almost elephanty looking one, let's say. So we have a lot of sort of variation. And potentially we also maybe start to see hair in some of these groups. Thinking about like fossil skin is tricky, right? But it's an area where we're finding more fossils, figuring out how to look at stuff more, right? Which is why we now think that dinosaurs have feathers, right? So we think that in some of these synapsids, these early therapsids, maybe we're seeing some hair here, even as far back as the upper Permian. In the Permian, we also had gliding reptiles, which is fun. So they're not flying, but we start to see the kind of expansion of some of these central areas into membranes that allow them to kind of float over the air. And so here's an example of Vigellatosaurus here, and a Permian gliding reptile. Here's a skeleton. Okay. And we have some of these in the modern day. So here is Dracotaniopterus. So this is a Thai flying lizard, right, that similarly kind of glides. So you can see here that really what we're doing is kind of like expanding this like rib area and expanding the membranes and that skin going over that region. This is a new way of almost flying, different than what we saw in the insects, where we saw them kind of repurposing some of their gill structures. So now we're repurposing kind of these rib structures here. We do still have an ocean in the Permian. So here we are looking at the Permian Basin. So we have some reefs here. There are a bunch of them in modern day West Texas. So they are part of where our modern oil deposits come from. So we talked about coal deposits. Oil deposits are kind of the same way. So we have dying off of organic material getting buried underground. So this was happening in these regions, kind of at these coastal margins, kind of near the reefs. Okay. At the end of the Permian, we have an enormous mass extinction. Right. So here we're looking at the landmass at this time period. We'll talk more as we enter the Triassic about like why the Permian mass extinction happened, but one of the reasons that we think this happened is because of these structures called traps. So we're looking at the Siberian traps here. So it derives from a word for step-like hills, but essentially you want to think of them as like literally the floor is lava, right? Just like giant layers of volcano almost. They're traps. So we got a big field of fire and lava kind of covering vast spans of the landscape. So here we can see, kind of zooms in where the Siberian traps are forming. So we think that this may have seriously shifted the environmental conditions as it shifts the atmospheric composition. So here we can zoom in. So this is our third mass extinction here between the Permian and the Triassic. So we saw one dying off, the first one at the end of the Ordovician. That was our first mass extinction. Second was at the end of the Devonian here. And now our biggest is at the end of the Permian going into the Triassic, third mass extinction. So pretty big. We're looking at invertebrates and our marine invertebrates. More than 90% of all species died, and 52% of all families. So you can imagine how many are left in the remaining families. We had 90% of the species leaving, right? So really, really big disaster in our oceans for kind of the third time in the Paleozoic, right? They've experienced a number of catastrophic events for that marine fauna. We look at the terrestrial invertebrates, so our bugs, basically. The Permian, at the end of the Paleozoic, we see lots of diversification of insects and invertebrates. We saw that some of them are getting huge because of all that oxygen available to them. We see lots and lots of different types, but at the end of the Permian, this is actually the only time we have noticed in the fossil record a mass extinction that actually does kill insects. Insects are pretty hardy otherwise. So actually 8 or 9 orders of insects became extinct. So order, right, down on the side, right, this is our kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So those are our taxonomic ranks. So that's what that O is indicated. Right, so orders are pretty high up. So 8 or 9 large groups of insects died off during this time period. Right? So most of the fossil insect groups that we're going to see as we move into the Triassic are going to be quite different than those prior to this extinction. Plants also change. So palynology refers to the study of pollen, so pollen. We think that around the same time, we had a big change in the distribution of the plants on land. So before this and Permian extinction event, we think we had dense woodlands of gymnosperms. So in the Carboniferous, we had a rainforest with lots of not moss-like, but kind of moss-like things that grew into trees. They died off as it got patchier. Ferns took over, became seed ferns, became things like conifers, which are what gymnosperms are. At the end of the Permian, we start to see those gymnosperms dying off. And then we have the rise of some small little herbaceous plants. So herbaceous plants are ones that are kind of green and die off every season rather than being big and have trunks. Okay. We're going to see more gymnosperms coming back after this extinction event, but it is pretty noticeable that we have a shift here in the plants at the end of the Permian as well. We also see an end to the coal formation as we have these huge extinction events at the end of the Permian and in the early Triassic. So before this extinction event, we had woodlands dying off, forming peat, getting trapped as coal. We suddenly have a coal gap in the geological record around this time period. So you see thick coal formations below this date. And then afterwards, there really aren't any more coal seams. So that's another way we can tell that something has shifted as far as plants go. In terms of our vertebrates, also got a lot of dying, right? Big extinction for kind of everybody. So before the extinction at the end of the Permian, we have a bunch of those terrestrial amphibians. Some of them are surviving that Carboniferous rainforest collapse. We had our early amniotes spreading out. We had some early reptiles, some of our early synapsids here before that split. During the Permian, lots and lots of those terrestrial amphibians die off. Pretty much all of the anapsid reptiles die off, which is why we don't have any anymore. And the groups that do remain do still suffer pretty heavy losses. So even though we do still see modern reptiles, which are in a group called sauropsids, and our mammals in that sauropsid group, still see lots and lots of dying there. Most of the dying, or at least the biggest groups to die off, are big herbivores, so things that were eating the plants. So again, probably a suggestion that the plants did not do great during this extinction event. We will be talking about archosaurs a lot in our next unit because archosaurs are going to lead us into like our dinosaurs and our birds. So we don't see all that many archosaurs during the Permian, but as we move into the Triassic, we're going to see lots and lots of archosaurs. So they're going to kind of explode as we move past this extinction event. This is just a picture of the geology here. So you can really see physically with your eyes, I didn't do anything to this picture, the difference between the Permian and then the Triassic. So you can really see that extinction event horizon and that huge change in the geology right there at that line. That border is quite clear to see. Okay. We'll talk about that Permian mass extinction a little more after our exam as we move into the Triassic and our new era, the Mesozoic. But here's a bunch of the stuff we think was going on, right? So we can see that volcanism, we see changes in temperature, changes in that oxygen, changes in what's going on in the oceans, in the different regions. Okay, talk about all those parts next time. I don't want to talk about breaking fireballs right now. Oh, I thought I did this. Okay, we're gonna get to this stuff next time. What I wanted to get to. I put in a lot more slides than I meant to get to. Okay, we want to go to the last slide, is what I'm saying. So I'll just delete these out of here for right now. Especially because lots of us are gone. Okay, so as we finish up class, this is kind of fun. So I'm gonna play around with this a little bit. This will be potentially helpful for thinking about phylogenies as we go into the exam anyway. So we have a little kind of tree building thing. So we can start to build together trees. You can watch the videos if you want, or you can just start to play. You're gonna be able to like drag and drop things together and then drag on some of our synapomorphies onto this tree. And at least the first two examples are things that we have talked about so far. The third tree they have you build is about plants to a level of detail we haven't covered, but let's play around with this for a little bit and then we're done. Does it work on phone? That's the question. Yeah. No, you can play around with it. Just sort of reinforce some of the things that we talked about, right? So we should know which cells have nuclei. There's some like synapsid, diapsid stuff in the next example. I'm just giving us some examples of how we get sister groups, how do we arrange.
So it's, can you tell me the kingdom?
Oh yeah. Kingdom, phylum, class. Order, family, genus, species.